let's talk about how to begin playing a drum set. Say you've never held sticks before. We should be able to get going and playing some of these essential grooves very quickly. All you need to do is use the two simplest rhythmic beats that exist, which are quarter notes and eighth notes. You want to have eighth notes in your hi-hat generally, 2 and 3 and 4 and 1. And then your bass drum's going to hit on beats 1 and 3, and your snare drum's going to hit on 2 and 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. I'm going to put all those together. It's nice to start at a tempo like quarter note equals 80. You can play nice and relaxed. Try to work on making not huge motions with your hands, but just using the motion that is required to play what you need to play. Let's play this simple groove. I'm going to call it groove number 1 because this is the first groove that everybody should learn on drum set. 2, 3, 4. One of the things that helps me make sure everything's lined up is I look at where the most subdividing is happening, and that's on my hi-hat with the eighth notes. So I focus in on that 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1. And then I make sure that my right foot or my left hand are attacking at the very same time that my right hand is keeping that subdivision. So I'm going to just sometimes practice just quarter notes with each limb. Just my right foot with the hi-hat and then just my snare drum. 2, 3, 4. Practicing this very slow and very controlled can help you get an evenness in your sound, which is essential to being a solid drummer. Everything needs to be coming out very even and relaxed. So you just want to make sure that everything's lining up. I'm going to turn the metronome down to 60 and play it even slower. The trick about drums is really to learn to play the instrument slowly. If you start trying to play everything fast, like it might hear on a record, you're going to get tripped up. But if you start really slow in the beginning, you're going to ingrain good habits on your playing. And then when you start to get into more complicated music and rhythm, it's going to all come out much more even and controlled. Here we go, playing just quarter notes in the bass drum and then snare drum, and then I will eventually go into the actual groove at quarter note equals 60. 2 and 3 and 4 and... Once we have this framework established, we can start to add another eighth note with the bass drum. Again, I'm going to try to make sure I'm lining it up with my right hand. So I'm going to be thinking of my whole right side of my body. If I'm cut down the middle, I'm going to think of my right hand and my right foot working together. So I'm just going to play a quarter note on beat 1 and then beats 3 and the and of 3 on my right foot, and I'm going to keep my snare drum just at 2 and 4. Let's see what that sounds like. 2, 3, 4. Once you start being able to play 2 eighth notes with your bass drum, a great exercise to do to develop some independence and fluidity with your right foot is to start trying to play 2 eighth notes on each of the 2 different eighth note groupings throughout the measure. I'm going to demonstrate this now again at quarter note equals 60. I'm going to start with 1 and 3 and then I'm going to go to and 2 and 4, and slowly start moving these 2 eighth notes through all the different beats, starting on each different eighth note within the measure. But when I do it, all of them are always going to be lining up with my right hand, and as long as my snare drum's still on 2 and 4, you're still going to be feeling the groove as such. I'm going to play each one through for 2 bars and then move over 1 beat. So here we go. 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 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 2 and 3 and 4 and 1. Starting to familiarize yourself with playing the bass drum on all these beats will help you when you come up with deciding to play your own grooves. You'll be able to start putting your right foot where you want it rather than being dictated by an independence issue. So now I'm going to improvise with this idea of moving these 2 eighth notes around. But again, they're always going to be going with my right hand. And this is going to help you start coming up with your own ideas about what a groove could be. 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 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 2 and 3 and 4 and 1. Don't necessarily try to just transcribe what I've just played, but try to see where you want to play the bass drum and move it through. Now, I want to discuss some other basic grooves that involve this pattern, or a quarter note and 2 eighth notes in the bass drum. When we went over the first one of playing 1, 2, 3, and 4, that's more of a rock and roll groove. If you were to be playing an R&B song, instead of playing 3 and, you might play 1, 2, and 3. So let's see what that sounds like. 2, 3, 4, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 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 1. So as I said, that's a typical R&B groove. You go and listen to Earth, Wind & Fire, you're going to hear that groove all over the place. Also, standard funk groove would be to add the and of 4 to 1. So you have 1, 2, and 3, 4, and 1, 2, and 3, 4, and 1. Let's put that with the metronome and add the hi-hat. 2, 3, 4, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 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 1. Starting to go over all these grooves is going to start to get you a basic vocabulary to be playing most music that you hear around today. Now I want to discuss putting 16th notes in the hi-hat at the same tempo, but still keeping the same bass drum patterns that we've been working with. And we'll see how that changes the feel of these beats. So I'm going to go back to just quarter notes, but I'm going to play 16th notes in my hi-hat now. 2, 3, 4, and 1, and 2, and 3, and 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 4, and 1, and As I was demonstrating the earlier grooves with 8th notes and 16th notes in the hi-hat, that's more dependent on how slow the song is. If the song's faster, you might not be able to play 8th notes or 16th notes in the groove. So sometimes quarter notes on the hi-hat will suffice. So now I've got my metronome up at 110, and I'm going to just play quarter notes in my hi-hat and play 1 and 3 in the bass drum and 2 and 4 in the snare drum. And let's see what that sounds like. 3, 4. You can also try to put the bass drum on all 4 beats. And that is somewhat tricky because you want to make sure that your right foot and now your left hand are going to be working in tandem. Before it was your right foot linking up with your right hand and you're divided down the middle. Now you have to start thinking about how your left hand and your right foot are going to attack at the same time. So let's do the same groove, but now just add the bass drum on 2 and 4 as well. 2, 3, 4. You can also try opening your hi-hat for grooves like this. If you're going to be playing only quarter notes, it might be during a chorus in contrast to a groove that maybe had 8th notes in it. So let's see what happens if I open my hi-hat a little bit and play that same groove. 3, 4. Once you start getting these grooves down, it's important to then start trying to fill at the end of every 4 or 8 bars. If you can start trying to put your own fills in at the end, you'll start to develop your own vocabulary of fills, but also just the standard phrasing that exists in most Western popular music. 4s and 8s are usually the more typical phrase lengths that are grouped. And if you get comfortable at playing 4 bars and then doing a simple fill on the snare drum, for instance, even just 1 extra beat, you're going to start understanding songs when you hear them on the radio or when you listen to a CD. It's going to start to make sense. So I'm going to demonstrate playing this groove, and after 4 bars, I'm going to add like 1 extra beat on the snare drum as a fill. And let's see what happens with something like that. 3, 4. There's a few simple ideas to get you started, but to me, fills and playing around the drums is a more melodic approach. So I always try to have my own thing to say. And if you start coming up with some fills that are more your own, that you're hearing in your head or that you feel, you're going to start to develop your own sound. When practicing these simple, basic grooves on the drums, we want to make sure that we're getting everything locked in and together and in time. So when you hear your metronome clicking away, try to bury the metronome. And a good exercise to work on getting your right foot to have some more independence is to try playing all the quarter notes in your bass drum with your snare drum on 2 and 4 for 2 bars, and then move all those downbeats to the upbeats, which are the offbeats, which are also clicking on your metronome if you have the 8th note volume up. So I'm going to count out loud, and I'm going to start by playing the bass drum on the downbeats, and then I'm going to move to playing the bass drum on the offbeats. And let's see what that sounds like. 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 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 4 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1. Once you start developing the independence to play your bass drum either on the downbeat or on the offbeat, you can start experimenting with either 2 beats or 3 beats in a measure and try to vary 1 being on a downbeat and 1 being on an upbeat, or 2 being on downbeats and 1 being on an upbeat, or 1 being on the downbeat and 2 being on the upbeats. So let's see what happens when I move my bass drum to the end of 3 instead of 3, but still play it on 1 with my snare drum on 2 and 4. 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 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 2 and 3 and 4 and 1. What happens if I just move the offbeat to the end of 4? 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 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 4 and 1. So you see where I'm going with this. You can start moving all these beats around to different parts of the measure and see what it feels like. And then you start to come up with what you like to hear and what feels good for you to play. Now I'm going to show you one of the most basic Motown grooves, a little bit slowed down. It's going to involve the bass drum on 1, the and of 2, and the and of 3. And obviously the snare drum's still going to be on 2 and 4. This is using now 3 bass drum beats, and I've got 1 on the downbeat and 2 on the offbeats. So let's see what this sounds like. 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 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 2 and 3 and 4 and 1. Now I want to demonstrate playing at the same tempo, quarter note equals 60, but varying up whether I'm playing bass drum on a downbeat or an offbeat. And I might sometimes play rhythmic sets with 2 eighth notes, but I'm not going to exceed more than 2 eighth notes at once in my bass drum, and I'm not going to play anything outside of a quarter note or an eighth note. So once you start becoming familiar with some of these basic grooves, then just try to hold down your hands and focus in on your right foot and make sure your right foot is locked with your right hand, but focus in on your right foot to be improvising around the groove. So let's see what happens here. 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 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 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 So you can see I start moving them around the measure. All of a sudden I have different grooves all springing from this one simple concept of eighth notes and quarter notes and no more than two at once on my bass drum. You can also apply this concept to your snare drum and keep your right foot and your right hand doing the same. That's how you start to develop grace notes on the snare drum or ghost notes. So let's see what happens when I play my bass drum on 1 and 3 and now vary up my right hand or my left hand a little bit. Using the same eighth notes only and quarter notes only with my snare. 2, 3, 4, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1, 2, 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 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 3 and 4 and 1. Once you start grasping these basic concepts, you can start to move these ideas to different sound sources like the toms, the cymbals, and all that. I recommend starting all this very slow, but try to be exploring on your own. That's the big goal with music, is to explore and develop what you want to say and what you're trying to play and what sounds good to you. Try to make it personal. I've been introducing the quarter note, the eighth note, and even the 16th note on the hi-hats. That's going to either be one hit per beat, 2 hi-hats per beat, or 4 hi-hats per beat. There's also triplets. That's 3 notes per beat. And that's going to change the feel completely. And when I think in triplets, I'm also going to have to vary my bass drum. If I'm trying to do 2 notes, instead of doing them on eighth notes, I would do it with the triplet. So first I'm just going to play 4 quarter notes on my bass drum and 2 and 4 and just show you what it sounds like to play the 3 subdivision in my right hand. I still have the quarter note at equals 60. 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1 triplet, 2 triplet, 3 triplet, 4 triplet, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1 triplet, 2 triplet, 3 triplet, 4 triplet. So now, if I want to start putting 2 beats in my bass drum, I'm still going to line it up with my right hand. However, it's going to feel differently. It's not going to be like that anymore. Now I'm going to have to play with the triplet. And generally when I'm playing with the triplets, I'm going to be doing it as like a pickup to the downbeat instead of playing after the downbeat.